Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Alex Deegan and I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Law here at the Queensland University of Technology. I'm the coordinator of the QUT Global Law, Science and Technology Seminar Series, which brings together national and international speakers who explore the personal, societal and governance dimensions of solving real-world problems, which are influenced by and through the interaction of science, technology and the law. I'd like to officially welcome you all to today's seminar. It's so pleasing to see participants from the profession and from universities all around the world. In this fourth seminar of our series, we are going to hear from Professor Fleur Johns, who is a Professor of International Law and Legal Theory at the University of New South Wales Faculty of Law. Today, Professor Johns will be presenting to us on #Health, the digital transformation of humanitarianism and the governance of populations, which is part of a project funded by the Australian Research Council. You can find an abstract for this seminar in the information for this event. The format for the seminar will be as follows. Professor Johns will speak for about 35 minutes, and then this will be followed by a structured Q&A session, which I'll chair. For the Q&A session, if you wish to ask a question, you have a few options. You can select the participant bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen and select either the yes or a green tick in the participant window. Or you can select the button to raise your hand, or you can just post in the chat, and then I'll either call on you to ask a question, or if it's in the chat, I'll just read it out myself, and then Professor Johns will respond, and we'll go to the next person or question, and so on and so forth. Of course, as usual, for this seminar, I just request that you adhere to the Zoom meeting protocol by keeping yourself muted, except where you may be called on to ask a question during the Q&A. So thank you very much for being here today. I'm really looking forward to this seminar, and I'll turn it over to Professor Johns.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thanks also to Afshanata Kavari and Catherine Christensen and Ross Hutton for the invitation and for putting together all the logistics for today. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk with you about some work in progress that I have been engaged with in collaboration with others who I'll identify in a moment for several years. So you will have seen from the abstract, let me just share my screen. You will have seen from the abstract that I want to talk with you today about some changes in the techniques and objects of governance that are being advanced in humanitarian work on the national and also on the global plane in connection with the burgeoning adoption of digital technology and recourse to digital data for a range of purposes. And the way I'm talking about that today, I think is well captured by this quote from Ian Hacking, the Canadian philosopher of science, who will be known to most, if not all of you, for his work on statistics. And this quote from Hacking really captures what I'm interested in exploring as a stake in this shift in the objects and techniques of governance. So when we develop and implement law and policy, we're never just taking the world as we find it, we are also making the world, and especially the people and things and places that are the towards which our particular law and policy measures are addressed. So we classify people for purposes of governing them. And the way that we classify people changes how we think about them and talk about them and try to govern them. And also what's possible for those people, or the people, places and things captured by our techniques of governance, to do in response or in the context of those governance efforts. So one example would be in 2005, the statistical category of persons with a migration background was introduced in Germany. And as has been discussed in work by Jennifer Elric and Louisa Farah-Schwartzman, that engendered new ways of imagining and addressing the German polity and dividing it up. It played a role in social democrat thinking around affirmative action, in the education setting in particular, but it also played a role in far-right thinking and talk about who did and didn't belong in Germany. So that's an illustration of the kind of process of making up a new formation of the social, or a new form of the polity or division of the polity that I'm describing. In that context, one that took place in the context of statistics. So I'm interested in how we make up people, or how we're changing how we make up people for purposes of providing them with humanitarian aid, emergency relief, or development assistance. And in particular, what the introduction of digital technology as mediators of that process, what effect that has. So what I'm describing is something of a shift in techniques and objects that can be described in terms of a shift from statistical thinking to digital thinking. Now, this is obviously not an absolute shift, because digital thinking implements statistical methods, or digital methods implement statistical methods, and because statistical thinking in its traditional modes is very much alive and well. So I'm not suggesting that we're abandoning statistics and moving to data science, but I'm paying attention to a shift in the way that we represent and analyse certain social and environmental and political formations, and asking what happens when we move from statistical thinking to digital thinking in attempts to govern the global. What exactly is being made governable in the process, or how is the terrain of governance reconfigured in that shift? And to illustrate this, I've presented you with two images, two representations of a field of governance, or a goal of governance, if you like. The first is a tabular representation of a kind that will be very familiar to you, of estimated and projected total fertility for the world by region. So here you'll see a number of very familiar demographic categories or aggregates around which international humanitarian governance has long been oriented. Categories that are in a variety of ways controversial, but nonetheless widely used. So the categories of woman, child, women and children, regions, and also a number of developmental groupings, more developed, less developed, and so forth. The second, on the right-hand side, is a representation of the approximately 600,000 mobile phone subscribers that can be traceable to the districts of Palu, Sigi, and Donggala that were most affected by a massive earthquake that hit Sulawesi in Indonesia on the 28th of September 2018. And this representation was developed as part of an experiment or a pilot developed by UN Global Pulse. And I'll explain in a moment who they are. But for now, I just wanted to draw attention to some features that distinguish these two representations of a terrain for governance. The second representation, this digital one, compares subscribers' mobile phone positioning data from a period immediately before the earthquake and immediately afterwards. So it captures data from the 1st to the 27th of September and compares that with data from the 1st of October 2018 to 31st of January 2019. And it was developed as a way of exploring ways that digital data sources, in this case mobile phone data, might supplement traditional methods of tracking people's movement in the immediate aftermath of disaster. And the traditional method in question, most in question, was the International Organization for Migration's Displacement Tracking Matrix, which relies for baseline assessment on individual and household registration and surveys carried out by in-country DTM teams in collaboration with local and national governments. So a traditional statistical method was, UN Global Pulse was exploring how you might supplement that with mobile phone data. So these two exercises in measurement are obviously designed for quite different purposes, and they are measuring quite different things. But they're both, as I've said, concerned with representing a field of governance, or in a field in which certain governmental interventions may be made to humanitarian ends. And let's focus on the modes of aggregation in each, because again, I'm interested in modes of aggregation, modes of representation, modes of making people up in particular configurations. The units of analysis, once they become digitized, obviously become mobile, and they become capable of representation in something much closer to real time. They also rely on a different form of proxy. So both of these representations obviously depend upon a proxy for the humans. So in the first instance, a number of numbers and statistical categories. And in the second instance, the proxy is the data being emitted, either GSM radio signals, or in the case of those with smartphones, a global positioning data. So the proxy changes in nature, and it also moves away from the tradition of sampling. So the proxy, in the second sense, this data that's being analysed is not a statistical sample. It is not something that's been amassed for a particular purpose for the purposes of statistical analysis. And so one implication of this change in the nature of the proxy is that the connection between this mobile positioning data and the human bodies that it is meant to represent is both potentially more precise, but also potentially loosened. So it's what it captures is what McFarland and McFarland have described as precise inaccuracy. So one might come to this and think of each of these dots in movement as a body in movement. And in that case, it seems to be much more, it seems to disaggregate these very broad categories that appear in the first graph. But it's important to recall that each of these is a device in movement and a record of subscriber data. And as is often the case in places like Sulawesi, many people, particularly poor people, will share their phones within households, among family and friends, sometimes rent them out as a small business. And also even people who have a phone of their own will often maintain multiple subscriptions and use them for different purposes to try and minimize costs. So in fact, these dots are not so much representative of a body, but any one body may well be distributed across several dots. So this is the kind of precise inaccuracy that I'm talking about. A further thing a distinction that I wanted to draw attention to is the relationship to jurisdictional boundaries. So in the first, you've got well-recognized jurisdictional boundaries and data organized with reference to those, affirming those. In the second, the signals in question will often be picked up by multiple towers spanning several jurisdictions, or networks may be accessed across jurisdictional boundaries. So even though the visualization imposes the data upon a map as though it were firmly tethered to or could easily be cabined within a jurisdictional boundary, actually the data is indifferent to those jurisdictional boundaries. And there's always an element of selection and choice about, particularly when the scale of the data is very different to the jurisdictional boundary. So if we were to go down even further, then you would see more stretching and pulling and pushing of the data to get it to fit or approximate a fit to a jurisdictional boundary. So the relationship between the data and jurisdictions and the authority that's tethered, law and policy authority, legal and policy authority that's tethered to jurisdiction, is loosened or transformed as well. So having regard to these and other dimensions of the shift that I'm characterizing as a shift from statistical thinking to digital thinking, recognizing that of course the former is alive and well and that they are in many ways entangled in one another. So, but just go with me with this sort of overbroad characterization of the shift. So one question for me that this gives rise to is, if the population is the end of governance in the first instance, and I'll speak to what I mean by that in a second, then is it still the end of governance in the second instance? Are they actually representing the same object and inviting intervention upon the same object of governance or field of governance? And if not, if the mobile digital aggregate that's represented in the second instance is best understood as something other than a population, then how and to whom may that be significant? Or what are some of the stakes in this change in the way that the terrain of humanitarian governance is being represented and understood? So all this, just stepping back for a moment, these questions, the pursuit of these questions around the population are questions that I take up with my co-author in a chapter of a book that is in the process of being written. So let me just briefly contextualize this within the larger project. So asking these questions as part of a project in which I've been engaged for some time. I first started doing interviews on this topic in 2015. And as Alex mentioned, I've been funded since 2018 by the Australian Research Council on a project in which I have a co-investigator, Wayne Wobke, who's in computer science at UNSW and is working on some of the methodological questions that I'll allude to in a moment. And one of the key outputs of this project is a book that I'm co-authoring with Caroline Compton, who I believe is on the call today, who's a lecturer at Western Sydney University and has been the research associate before she started at Western Sydney, has been the research associate on this project. So this is very much collaborative work. And the background for this is one with which you're no doubt very familiar. So some 67% of the world's population uses a mobile phone. About 45% are active on social media. Those are figures provided by We Are Social, which is one of the many compilers of data on these phenomena. And of course, advances in satellite image data and its automated analysis open up new possibilities for remote analysis with ever increasing granularity. So I mentioned these three different sources of alternative data, alternatives to statistical data. But there are others as well that one could speak about. So there are a wide range of efforts ongoing to try and tap these streams of digital data to try and understand where people are and how they're doing physically, socially, economically, and so forth. So we have been studying, Caroline and I have been studying the people who are working in and around this initiative, UN officials, government officials, contractors, private sector partners. We're looking at what they're working on, how they're working, how they're envisioning and depicting the world. Importantly, we're not studying whether they deliver what they promise. So we're not studying their impact, the impact of their work on intended beneficiaries. And we're really focused on the legally and politically constitutive effects of their work, irrespective of whether they actually do what they say on the box, as it were. Once again, we're interested in using that language from Ian Hacking, how this work is making up people in new ways, if it is indeed people, that is in an embodied, politically agentive sense, that are being made up. Perhaps that's not always the case. So we're examining change in the book as a whole. We're examining change in the political economy of international humanitarianism associated with the influx of new interfaces and institutions. We look at change in the practices of digital mapping for humanitarian purposes and changing representations of emergencies and populations. And today, obviously, speaking mainly to this populations chapter. And we're also examining the way that rules, standards, and norms are being newly produced and imbibed and transmitted in contemporary humanitarian practices by virtue of the influx of the digital in that practice. One of our primary research sites has been Pulse Lab Jakarta, which is a joint venture between the UN and the government of Indonesia, which has funding from a range of sources, including the government of Australia. And that itself is part of a broader initiative, UN Global Pulse, that I mentioned earlier, which was launched over 10 years ago by the UN Secretary General with a mandate to try and enable, showcase and promote the scaled adoption of big data innovation for sustainable development and humanitarian action. That's the language they use. We've also, though, been looking at other projects and platforms by other agencies, such as the World Food Programme. So that's the context for this inquiry. But back to the population. So traditionally, modern governance has been concerned with making and managing populations and managing people by reference to a population, managing subsets by reference to a population. And I'm using here a classical sense of the population in a statistical sense as a real or hypothetical totality of objects or individuals under consideration of which the statistical attributes may be estimated by the study of a sample or samples. So Foucault and others have documented how from the end of the 18th century onwards, securing a population became, in his words, the final end of government. Security in this setting is, as you know, a sort of homeostasis to be achieved by maximising positive elements and minimising what is risky and inconvenient or unproductive. So threats to the population are to be controlled by managing estimates of probabilities and distributing estimates of probabilities. So you can see the centrality of statistics to that project. So the population here doesn't mean any pre-existing group of people. It is an artefact assembled for purposes of governmental management to try to achieve this homeostatic balance or optimization of human life and its productivity from birth to death. And Foucault obviously draws links to political economy, the birth of political economy. So if, as I'm suggesting here, drawing upon that extensive body of work, the population has been key to the modern governance project, what happens when we digitize it? What happens when we start crowdsourcing our knowledge of the population using digital sensors, satellite imaging, anonymized mobile phone data, GPS data, and so on? Typically gathered in ways that don't adhere to statistical sampling, remembering that definition. So we argue in the book that in the work of digital humanitarianism taking hold worldwide, the statistical artifact of the population may be undergoing something of a declension, or a relative decline in formal standing. It's still influential, but it's undergoing a shift in status comparable perhaps to that which the family underwent at an earlier historical moment. That is, it is becoming an interior dimension of the social formation, while governmental attention tends to be preoccupied in the first instance with eliciting and addressing something else. And that something else is, in the context we're looking at, a succession of digital aggregates, many of them only prototypically formed. So prototypes are everywhere here in this area of humanitarian practice. And those digital aggregates may, in many instances, overlay the population as an object of inquiry, representation, and governance. So they operate as a kind of screen that attracts attention in its own right. And this is a shift, we argue, that has potentially very significant legal, political, and economic implications that we try and explain in the book. So to be clear, the work of biopolitical governance focused on populations continues at all levels. Governance continues to be focused on making live and letting die, to use that classical phrase, oft-quoted phrase of Foucault, on population-wide scales. And that is never more so than in this time of pandemic, clearly. Nonetheless, when the end of government gets rendered digitally, in the first instance, that which is to be ensured, sustained, and multiplied is not necessarily biological human life, but rather the flow, assemblage, and reassemblage of data. It is the data that needs to be optimized first. So governments, international organizations, and their many private sector partners seem increasingly captivated by speculative digital aggregates as expressions of the end, the object, and the appropriate field of intervention for humanitarian work. And a concern with populations in the traditional statistical or actuarial sense at times seems to kick in only at a lower or a later stage, beneath or behind or embedded within the dazzle of a digital aggregate. So there's three main points that I want to tease out here from the claim that the population is undergoing a declension or a folding inwards behind digital aggregates in projects of humanitarian governance underway worldwide. First is the observation that new digital aggregates are emerging that overlay the population as a matter of humanitarian concern. And these are typically composites of high volumes of unstructured digital data, called detail records, satellite image data, social media data. And I've given you here three illustrations of generic forms of these digital aggregates. Poverty maps are assembled from satellite image data registering nightlights. And there's a range of papers that attempt this kind of mapping of poverty by using satellite image data. Nowcasts of basic commodity prices from social media data. So this is something with which the UN Global Pulse in Jakarta has experimented, using postings that contain pricing data as a way of making more timely pricing data and inflation data or indicators. And visualizations of emergency need and access after disaster, typically combining multiple data types. So again, the UN Global Pulse has produced a number of prototypes along these lines that looks at an area that's undergone some sort of disaster, typically a natural disaster, although we know that no natural disaster is just natural. And these typically combine social analysis of social media postings, sometimes data mining of traditional media sources, and combine these with official national statistics. So they're often hybrids of statistical and other forms of knowledge. And one consequence to which I've already alluded, or one dimension of this declension, is a loosening of the fit between sample and population. So it becomes difficult to say exactly what is being represented and how much is covered or not by the data in question. So I gave you the example of multiple users of a single mobile phone. And validation against so-called ground truth data remains a very live and active methodological concern. And this is something that my colleague Wayne Wobke is working on and could speak to more eruditely than I. But how different digital representations fare in that respect, fare in their attempts to validate themselves, is often not made apparent to those presented with the digital representations in question. So what you see, rather than a digital overlay over a statistical foundation of ground truth data, is often data all the way down. So data upon data upon data, the precise status of which, or the robustness of the claims of which, embedded in which, is not always made clear or negotiable on the surface of the platform or dashboard or visualization. So the other factor of this is that data analysis is often driven by the availability of a provision of data of a particular sort, rather than having data collected to achieve a certain aim. So often the mere fact of having a whole lot of data of a certain sort drives the ambition to make that data meaningful for some humanitarian purpose. So we've got a whole lot of shipping data. What can we say with that might speak to the SDGs? We've got a whole lot of mobile phone data. What can we say with that, as opposed to the standard, more traditional statistical task of saying we need to find out this about the population, and therefore we'll gather some data to address that question. So with this, the third dimension of this declension is the redirection of governmental attention that is associated with this, away from probabilistic rendering of the characteristics of biosocial mass towards the speculative representation of data about data, often attributed with some potential for spontaneous self-disclosure. So crowdsourced data often is invested with this quality of being self-disclosing, somehow authentically the speaking of the crowd. So that which is to be governed is not so much, or that which is put forward or represented as the field of governance is not so much a biosocial mass as a temporary configuration of concern, always time limited and likely to pass in the near future into some other configuration. So remember that map of Sulawesi. The biological or social data that is put forward as a basis for initial concern, a kind of early, a lot of these tools are early warning mechanisms, or they're intended to provide hints or alerts or the basis for further investigation. But the biological or social data that's presented and amassed at that point for that initial direction of attention is often quite scant and is typically dynamic, multi-source, and may often be apparently precise, but be precisely inaccurate in the ways that I described earlier. So the task of governance becomes that of extracting and then acting in a given moment on some knowledge that the aggregate may be represented digitally as having in and of itself, however selected and compromised its assemblage. So of course, the methodological problems and the problems of fit that I'm describing are things that people are working on, and they will improve over time. But the broader implications of the shift, the assemblage of a different type of aggregate, that's not something that will go away even if we get better at these particular questions of fit or accuracy of representation. So why should it matter then? Why, if I'm not pointing out problems that I have an immediate solution to, why does it matter if we're changing the way we govern in the humanitarian domain? Well, let me mention 3 stakes that I think are significant. The first is that we lack an extensive and widely used political vernacular around this and a public fluency around this. So, for example, one of the tools that UN Global Pulse has piloted uses geotagged tweets after a disaster as a basis for assembling potential sites of vulnerability. So it tries to determine how prepared people are or how well they're dealing with a disaster from their tweets in combinations with other data, and directs attention. So it's constituting potential sites of vulnerability and prospective governmental intervention. But when people post on Twitter, they're obviously not thinking of themselves as constituting a terrain for governance. They're not thinking of themselves as constituting a potential site of vulnerability, because the mode of the interaction is very much more individualized. They understand themselves to be posting on Twitter, and there's a range of norms and expectations around that. So there's not a good political vernacular around the project of creating a site of vulnerability and inviting governmental intervention for good and for ill when it takes that form. And this is related to this second point, which is that what is involved in the shift to a digital aggregate is often a rerouting of agency through commercial infrastructure. So if you think of that map I gave you earlier, what is embedded in that map is the reason why UN Global Pulse puts it forward is because they want the Indonesian government and non-governmental organisations and international organisations, they're suggesting that this is useful for those various agencies to help people understand where they are and to be able to work with them. So it's effectively a form of indirect claim making and a form of needs assessment. And so it's it has agentive implications. It's eliciting or calling forth the possibility of a transaction or a political relationship between forms of authority that have the capacity to provide assistance and prospective claimants of that assistance. And yet it is rooted through an infrastructure that's been created for entirely different purposes. So we have an infrastructure for amassing data and giving shape to polities and populations that's often rooted more, has traditionally been more rooted through public agencies, so elections, censuses, and so forth. But now we're seeing a rooting of the data collection exercise and this constitution of a polity through a mobile phone infrastructure or a social media infrastructure that's created for commercial service provision and revenue generation. So the project of making an infrastructure for claim making and needs assessment gets redirected through these institutions and infrastructures that are created with for entirely different purposes and organised with an orientation elsewhere. And the third and final stake that I'd like to highlight, or the reason why this matters, is that we don't have a good repertoire or a good set of tools for critique in this context. Of course, this is an area of an incredible body of work, and all sorts of people are doing fabulous work on this. So this is something, there's more to come, but our traditional political repertoire has tended to revolve around trying to get digital proxies to better match their human reference. So we worry about exclusion and bias, we worry about racial discrimination, gender discrimination, all these things. These are hugely important. We want the data to better match the diversity of human reference. But, and those remain hugely important. But those worries and the measures that the responses that they elicit don't address the challenges associated with making entirely new things that are only tangentially related to some pre-existing idea of the real and are only partially connected or hooked into our prevailing political vernacular. And indeed, arguments for greater inclusiveness and representativeness of digital data may just intensify some problematic political effects of digitisation of the field and objects of humanitarian governance. So for instance, when people have said to Google, your Google image data is racially biased, that has occasioned and legitimated a whole set of projects for collecting image data from minority communities about which there's been some, these have been documented, which we might have concerns about. So the type of political repertoire that we tend to deploy in response to these kinds of shifts has the unintended effect of doubling down on exactly the phenomena that we're trying to tackle. So in that sense, that's what I mean by a blunting of the tools of critique. Some of the tools of critique that have been oriented towards exclusion and bias actually have the effect of generating more of the same, or more of the phenomenon that is the target of the critique. So that seems a good point to open out to the room and or the virtual room and hear what you have to say on these questions, and I'd love to hear that. So over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fleur. That was a really interesting presentation. I'm just looking through the chat and there doesn't appear to be anything there. So we have a few options. If people want to indicate if they want to say something or ask a question, then do that on your participants window, or otherwise I'm happy for people to just talk and we can get a discussion going.
I'll go first. G'day, my name's Bruce Hankinson. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
So I've just finished my MPhil. Previously, in a previous role, I managed the State Disaster Coordination Centre for Queensland, and my research, I researched the Queensland disaster management arrangements, and I took the view of it as a complex system. What I found fundamentally, anecdotally, was that information fragility was in the system. But when I researched, I found that that information management's not really exercised at this collective level, and it takes a very sort of agency or agency-centric or public policy approach. And I think primarily, rather than it views, most government policy views humanitarian assistance or disaster management as a closed system. So i.e. it's saying, right, okay, well, here's our policy, we're just going to implement it, and it doesn't see it as an open system where all this data is there. So as a consequence, there is very little, and I like your term, political vernacular, to be able to understand what this new what the opportunities of digital transformation can provide. So I suppose my question really comes down to, data and policy. Are you starting to see, or have you seen, a change in policy where we can see, government's attention actually move to be able to use this data, or I know there's a want to be able to use this data, but what I've seen is it's focused, instead of creating good, strong policy, it's actually just, following something that looks, excuse my French, a bit sexy or a bit shiny, so to speak. So have you seen anything good in that sort of regard?
So they're really interesting observations, Bruce, and that really does gel with a lot of the things that we're finding. But in some respects and others not so much. So when you talk about this agency-specific focus, and the kind of attention to agency concerns in the immediate setting, rather than a kind of broader cross-sectoral conversation. That's something we observe as well, and it's intensified by the urgency of many of the situations. So you've got a really urgent problem, and so you need to focus on that problem. So it has a kind of tunneling effect towards certain problems that makes it hard to think beyond that. But having said that, at the international level, I don't think it's true to describe so much of a closed system in the way that you're describing in the state of Queensland. And there is quite a lot of active negotiation of the policy parameters under which this data will be shared and the conditions under which it will be used, but it doesn't always take the form that you would think. So a lot of that negotiation is taking the form of the negotiation of MOUs and contractual agreements. So for instance, UN Global Pulse we mentioned earlier, they have an arrangement with Twitter that they get access to the Twitter fire hose at no charge. But whenever they want to use the Twitter fire hose, they have to go back and say to Twitter, this is what we propose to use it for, and this is what we're aiming to get out of it. And these are the parties involved and so forth, and Twitter signs off on that. So that's an illustration. There's a policy discussion either explicitly or implicitly around that. What's a good purpose for the use of data? What would be a valid purpose, and who's a legitimate participant in that, or who could or should be at the table? But it's being negotiated in this contractual or MOU type context. So what you're seeing is a kind of policy position that's an aggregate of all these contractual arrangements, also some other forms, not only contracts, but a large portion of the policy settings are being set in the form of contract. So private law is playing a really significant role, and the conflicts of law is playing a really significant role in this area in ways that it's not always easy to track because of the confidentiality of many of these arrangements. So there are people, including within these organisations, the chief data scientist at UN Global Pulse is really alive to a broader set of concerns around the use of digital data. And it's been interesting to see that move, because when I first started talking to them, all they wanted to talk about was privacy. And I said, I have no interest in privacy. It's really important, but I don't have any expertise in privacy. I don't want to talk about privacy. I want to talk about all the other questions, political and legal questions that arise around what you're doing. And they said, well, what are those? And I said, well, equity questions, distributive questions, and I raised a number of, and they said, well, it wasn't part of the conversation, but it is now, and not because I told them. That's obviously not at all been consequential, but because of various things like Cambridge Analytica. So they then, over the course of the last 5 years, that organisation, as a small window, has really changed the way it thinks of policy concerns, political worries, political conflicts around these questions in a way that I find quite promising. What we don't have, though, because of that structure of private contractual dominance, we don't always have the range of people in the room when talking about these issues. And we often have these overlays of ethical principles and so forth, which aren't really capturing the distributive questions, the shift in power, the shift in capital that is happening in these contractual arrangements. And it's just suggesting that if we overlay on this sort of broad principles about how people can act in more ethical ways, that somehow will address the damaging effects of those shifts in power and shifts of capital. And I think there's a very real mismatch.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I think the challenge that we've got is with being, humans almost being hyper connected, and the ability for if you're applying a complex adaptive system approach to it, that policy will never ever be able to meet, will always be behind the current trends in information systems and data, and therefore the system will find fitness in other areas and adapt, regardless of what's trying to be happening in the policy area. So I think to be able to write policy that actually is almost to a certain degree, future-proofed, to be able to use this data, and I'm very much about the application and developing systems that are agile, in my definition, that can take whatever data they've got and to be able to actually apply it to be able to get effective outcomes for communities is going to be a real challenge. Seeing that people will obviously trying to, take agency and get the best out of the things that they can. So it's going to be a very interesting space, to watch. And I think you're talking about those challenges of layers, and they're being able to say, well, if we apply a reductionist approach in relation to law, will it ever be able to meet, the current trend in digital change? I personally don't think it ever will. So it's definitely a challenge for policymakers, and it's great to see people like yourself, pushing the envelope in relation to research to do this sort of things, because that's definitely my area of interest as well.
Thanks, Bruce.
All right, we have a few questions coming through the chat now, so I'll just pose them to Fleur. So the first one is, thank you for a really enlightening presentation. I was wondering if you could say more about jurisdictional boundaries. In particular, are statistical populations related to traditional jurisdictional boundaries, and are digital aggregation shifting jurisdictional arrangements as well?
So thanks for that question. So I'm being a little bit caricatured in my representation of statistics, because obviously there's a whole body of computational statistics that's been advanced over many years, and I don't purport to have any expertise in that. But I think it is true in relation to the kind of public statistical exercises like censuses, that they have been closely tied to and oriented around jurisdictional boundaries that are publicly accessible, and the process for setting those has been a process with which we're familiar. So we understand how those jurisdictional boundaries shift over time, and we understand something of what is at stake when we change them. In contrast, the digital aggregates that I'm talking about, the kind of representation of the polity that the sort of platforms and dashboards that we're looking at present, do have this inattentiveness to jurisdictional boundaries, and any exercise of bringing the data to square with the jurisdictional boundaries always involves a degree of manipulation of the data. So scaling up, scaling down, which is undertaken as a mathematical exercise of getting the data to match the jurisdictions. But I think that is putting pressure on jurisdictional boundaries in a number of ways. And one is that if the call to action that these digital platforms present, the call to distribute resources, scarce public resources that they present, doesn't really match jurisdictional boundaries, then the temptation to deliver those, distribute those scarce public resources through processes that correspond to those boundaries is also, the rationale for doing so is somewhat weaker as well. So I think this supports a more fluid jurisdictional arrangements of the kind that you see working in practice when NGOs and international organisations are working alongside government agencies in many areas of great need in the world, where they exercise different forms of jurisdiction, some formal, some informal. So you'll see an international agency will establish its jurisdiction over a certain area in ways that is only tangentially related to the jurisdiction of the local government officials. So they might, they might be working in part of a province and not another part, and so forth. So I've written about this in a piece I published in the Netherlands Yearbook of International Law a few years ago, and also other ways in which digitisation of territory actually presents a new form of territory, which is not the same as jurisdiction. So I've talked about the way it represents territory, which has implications for jurisdiction. And Caroline Compton and I have written an article in Regulation and Governance, which talks explicitly about the different ways and the different types of jurisdiction which come to bear when you use these digital tools. And we've characterised those different types of jurisdiction, formal and informal, that these kinds of digital tools help to mediate and bring to bear. Yeah, Regulation and Governance is where that article appeared at the end of last year.
Thank you, Fleur. I'll move on to the next question in the chat. Can you comment about the differences and similarities between biopolitical governmentality and responsive regulation strategies to try to address evolving issues that are evolving as we advance? Can smart regulation and the like address the issues caused by monopoly players influencing law, and the recent Social Dilemma documentary bringing this issue to light with the general public?
Wow, there's a lot in there. So there's kind of two questions. So first, this question of relationship between biopolitical governance and responsive regulation. And then the second bit about monopoly players in law. Could you just restate, Alex, the second part of the question, just so I get it?
Yeah, that's fine. Can smart regulation and the like address the issues caused by monopoly players influencing law, and the recent Social Dilemma documentary bringing this issue to light with the general public?
So the relationship between biopolitical governance and the types of governance elicited by digital techniques, or the types of governance which tend to be supported and nurtured by digital technologies and digital and data analytics, is the subject matter of this chapter in which we go through at some length. And someone, when I presented the chapter in full, the written work as well, said to me, "Are you nostalgic for biopolitics?" And what I want to make clear is that biopolitics can easily be embedded in digital techniques, and is. I mean, we see that the way in which digital technology is marshaled to the task of quarantine and organising bodies and determining, making questions about the value of different bodies and the value of different lives, biological lives. We see that everywhere around us. So it's not a sharp distinction between biopolitics belongs with statistics, and after statistics, or when we digitize, we move away from biopolitics necessarily. But what we are suggesting in the chapter, in the fuller chapter, is that types of the orientation towards biopolitics and a concern and the kind of reading of a lot of the digital techniques and tools as just another version of quantification akin to statistics misses a lot of the shifts in question, and misses something of the way biopolitics shifts and something of the way in which other forms of governance which don't correspond to biopolitics. So this is where the orientation around the digital aggregate rather than the biosocial mass, or rather than the life, the duration of a biological life. There's, as I've tried to describe, there's ways in which some of these digital aggregates really direct attention away from the question of the biosocial mass or the question of the biological life. And you can almost govern, at least to some level, by responding to a sequence of early warnings or hints that appear in the data without those ever making a claim about biological condition or organising or presenting a representation of biological life. So that's the kind of shift I'm alluding to. So that means that some of what we've learned from the analysis of biopolitics, from Hannah Arendt through Foucault and others, is not well attuned to some of the phenomena we're now seeing. And so what I'm interested in is kind of thinking about where you go, how you stretch them, or where you complement them with other forms of analysis that learn from everything we've learned from that body of work on biopolitics, and particularly the body of work on statistical thinking. So whether smart regulation could counter monopoly players influencing law, I walk a fine line here, because I'm suggesting that the techniques matter in terms of the political implications and what's possible and what's not. But I'm not suggesting that they're wholly determinative of what's possible and what's not, because this is such a profoundly over-determined area. There are so many factors at play that you can't say that simply the move to smart regulation has a liberating effect, an emancipatory effect, or that it has a closing down effect, that it always supports the monopoly players. So I don't subscribe to either of those versions of the closure of these techniques, or the determinism of these techniques. So I would say that it is possible for smart regulation, regulation that's embedded in digital tools, that's explicitly embedded in digital tools, as well as the more implicit forms of smart regulation, which is what I'm really talking about, the way in which these tools constitute entities and fields for governance in ways that don't always appear in the regulatory texts or instruments. So I'm interested in both those forms of regulation. And I think it is possible for that kind of embedded regulation embedded in the technology or the governance effects of technology to both counter monopoly players influencing law and serve monopoly players influencing law. And there's a really nice explication of how those two possibilities coexist in Julie Cohen's book, Between Truth and Power, where she tracks this in relation to the US. And she holds to the possibility and to some extent demonstrates the actuality of a kind of counter conduct, but also demonstrates the way in which regulation embedded in technology and surrounding digital technology has really served monopoly players and existing interests very, very well, despite the fact that it's supposedly an unregulated area.
Great. Well, there's one final question in the chat, and I'm conscious of the time and people are starting to leave and so forth. So we will make this the last question. So final question. Using Foucault's governmentality as a conduct of conduct to understand how the use of projections derived from digital aggregates to make up and hence control the population, how do individuals resist against the exercise of power onto and through them?
So, a couple of things. Of course, a lot of the governmentality framework describes many aspects of the phenomena that I'm talking about. But there are ways also in which the practices that I'm talking about depart from the model of a governmentality kind of mode of governance. So if we think of governmentality being concerned in particular with the way that governance becomes embedded in certain forms of subjectivity and certain types of subject, the aspirational subject that tries to self-govern themselves to optimize themselves, to become, an entrepreneur of the self, as it were, then there are ways in which the digital practices I'm describing actually call forth a different type of subjectivity. And that's particularly the case when you're concerned with aggregates. So you might have noted here that I wasn't really talking about individual subjects at all. I was talking about the way in which we get constituted in the aggregate. Elsewhere, not in today's talk, I've also described ways in which we become newly constituted as individual subjects through the mediation of digital technology in ways that is not so much concerned with aspiring to become a better version of oneself and governing oneself to that end, but more concerned with continually generating data about oneself and then continually looking in the data for oneself. So the aspiration is not so much about entrepreneurship of the self as it is to both render the self learnable and to learn about the self. So it's a different type of aspiration and a different type of subjectivity that I think that is less concerned with self-governance, self-regulation, and more less interior-oriented. How can I become a better version of myself? How can I become fitter, healthier, blah, blah. Of course, that's all still underway and gets embedded in technology. But alongside that, you see a version that is more about how do I externalize myself and then locate myself in these external manifestations of myself. And this is something that, again, I've written about most recently with Marianne Fourcade in a piece in Theory and Society, but also am writing more about. So I do think there's ways in which the government, so to the first part of your question, there's ways in which governmentality analysis doesn't work for certain types of subjectivity that also have governance implications, but don't match the archetypes of governmentality. And then the second part of your question was, sorry, can you remind me, Alex, of the second part? Because I focused on the governmentality part.
Yeah, the second part of the question is how do individuals in that context resist against the exercise of power? Yes,
again, I do think there's ways in which, and again, this is something Marianne and I talk about, the ways in which individuals mess with that. So mess with that continual externalization of themselves. But the problem is that often a lot of the ways that we have learnt to mess with that is actually still subscribing to the imperative to produce more data. So we can think of the playful ways and also politically powerful ways that people mess with different machine learning algorithms. You know, the K-pop fans seem to be great masters of this. Individuals getting together and signing up to a particular program of data production that completely resists and problematizes a particular data gathering exercise or a machine learning techno-social kind of artifact that they're directed towards. So we can think of the various ways in which K-pop fans messed with efforts to surveil protesters during Black Lives Matter, for instance, in the US. So there are many illustrations of individuals and groups of individuals doing this kind of thing. But as I said, it's always in a position of complicity and immersion. So you're always somehow still subscribing to the data production and imperative. You know, there are other sort of more radical ascetic versions where you kind of go offline and you kind of pull the plug on everything, and that's also a form of resistance. But that's less interesting to me because it cleaves much less closely to this data production imperative. So I'm interested in the messing with rather than the complete withdrawal, because I'm always circumspect about the possibility of complete withdrawal when you've got commercial satellites and so forth, satellite image data and so forth. It's very hard to envisage what complete withdrawal looks like in many parts of the world. There are other ways that people protest that are not registered very widely as part of kind of free expression, and they don't get read as protest. But one illustration is this. So after the Boxing Day tsunami in 2004, the German and Japanese governments and the US and a few other governments worked together with the Indonesian government to implement these smart buoys as in floating buoys in the sea, that would record water levels and provide early warning systems. And then they also implemented complementary software that would provide ways of analysing and responding to this data and delivering early warning systems. But what happened, there's been some interesting papers that documented what happened with this software, is that after a very short period of time, it really wasn't delivering on the promise, because it didn't really respond to the ways in which people were living with tsunamis and the kinds of early warning mechanisms that were salient for people. And one manifestation of protest, which probably wasn't experienced or read as protest, was the propensity of local people fishing who were making their livelihood, were tying their boats up to these buoys, and they were also carting away the buoys for sale, because it was quite valuable, a lot of the infrastructure. So there you can think of that as a form of messing with the infrastructure that's actually not that helpful. Of course, it's important to save people's lives, but it's politically interesting because it draws attention to the way in which the interaction over how do we do better for the tsunami did not involve people whose practices were essential to the intended outcome, and where their counter-conduct, if you like, which, as I said, is not necessarily experienced as political protest or read as political protest, raises questions which are politically salient questions. So there's a lot of ways that we can think about protest, and not necessarily at the individual level, but also in the formation of aggregates and sub-aggregates around this, which is part of what I'm talking about when I'm interested in a political vernacular around this.
Wonderful. Thank you, Fleur, and thank you everyone for coming and participating here today. It was a really insightful and informative seminar and discussion, and I hope that everyone benefited from it. I'd particularly like to thank you, Fleur, for contributing your time and your expertise. In terms of the rest of the year for our seminar series, our final seminar for 2020 will be presented on the 20th of November by Professor Thaddeus Mason Pope, who is the Director of the Health Law Institute and Professor of Law at Mitchell Hamline School of Law. Professor Pope is also an adjunct professor with the Australian Centre for Health Law Research here at QUT, who are also co-hosting that seminar. Professor Pope will be presenting on patient rights and healthcare decision-making after COVID-19, transformations and future directions. So I'm sure that will be a very relevant and interesting seminar for all of us. And so I hope to see many of you there. Thank you very much.